Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we have a very exciting lecture. We're joined by Rachel Barrett from the London Archives. So Rachel is an archives officer at the London Archives, and this year she co-curated Lost Victorian City, if anyone's seen that, which ran until February 2025. As I've mentioned, we have some gruel over here on the table. It would have been a lot more watery, maybe less sugar. There was mixed things about that because sugar was expensive. But if you'd like to try, it's a rough remake of that, so help yourself. And we also have copies of the St Marylebone Workhouse just on that table as well. You can buy these, they're £5, and this was published by the St Marylebone Society, so they've been brought along today. I'm going to pass you over now. So thank you very much.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Rachel, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you all about Marylebone Workhouse during the Victorian period. I'm very thankful to St Marylebone and to Emma in particular for inviting me to talk to you today and to be part of this year's lecture series here. So my interest in the Victorian period and workhouses in particular came from my work on the exhibition that Emma mentioned on Lost Victorian City. It ran from 2024 until February 2025, and I definitely recognise some of your faces. You might have seen that exhibition if you went to the London Archives back then. So I was one of the curators on that exhibition. I did the work on workhouses, you might have guessed that one, also on street life and on Victorian work as well. And that was really, I hadn't studied the Victorians since I was in maybe primary school, so it was quite a learning curve. So yeah, it's come a long way since then. So at the London Archives, we basically hold nearly all the parish records for nearly all the parishes in London. And we also held nearly all the Board of Guardians and workhouse records for London and Middlesex as well. So if you're really interested in that kind of thing, the London Archives is really the place to go. So I'm going to talk about the development of the poor laws today, and also the development of workhouses in the period, as well as the buildings and daily lives of the inmates that were in them. And there will be time for questions at the end, so do get them ready and I'll do my best to answer them. So I'm just going to do a brief history of workhouses before we really get into it. I think it comes as a surprise to some people that workhouses aren't a Victorian invention. They've existed for centuries before the Victorians come along, and I think we have, Charles Dickens to blame for that with Oliver Twist, and we really get our vision and our knowledge of workhouses kind of does come from Oliver Twist as well. And there are debates, and there are debates with my colleagues at the London Archives about how accurate that depiction of workhouses is. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from what I have to tell you. So while social welfare in the form of poor relief is usually dated to the Elizabethan period in 1601, with the passing of the Act of the Relief of the Poor, it's actually not until 1631 and during the reign of Charles I that the first recorded and known use of the term workhouses is found. And that's when the Mayor of Abingdon announces to everyone that he's going to erect a workhouse to set the poor people to work. So all the way back in 1631, we already have workhouses. Poor relief, including workhouses, are a parish-run institution at this time. Parishes have massive amounts of civil power, pretty much up to the Victorian period. So they have all this civil power over all of their parishioners, as well as the spiritual power they wield as well. So you get to this 18th century, and you find the 1723 Workhouse Test Act. That basically provided parishes with the option of denying out relief. Out relief is basically poor relief that is given by parishes without the need to go into an institution. You don't need to go into a workhouse to receive relief. So that's kind of in the form of either money or clothing or food, and it's a great way to not have to spend your time in a workhouse and get to live your life outside of it. Clearly, the government wanted to close that loophole because the Workhouse Test Act got rid of out relief and kind of really brought workhouses to the forefront of poor relief. And it kind of triggered building of workhouses all over the country. Not all parishes did it, but some of them did. And obviously Marylebone Workhouse is one of those parishes that did choose to build a workhouse at that time. The illustration on screen here is actually late Victorian, and it's a depiction of Marylebone Workhouse during its partial demolition in 1898. It's actually from the Westminster City Archives, so thanks to them, not from the London Archives, because they also have some Marylebone Workhouse records as well, to give them credit. But what's the earliest Marylebone Workhouse document the London Archives actually holds? Well, from what I can find, you're more than welcome to come in and have a look and try and prove me wrong here. But that honour goes to this document on screen here, which is a register of admissions to the workhouse, and it actually dates from October 1769 to December 1772. So it's quite an early workhouse record. Lots of records from this period don't survive at all, so we're quite lucky to have this one. So Marylebone's really one of the early adopters of workhouses. They don't wait for reforms during just before the Victorian period to build them. They're really, they're quite committed to giving poor relief to the poor, but they're also, you should always remember that they're trying to beat up financial burden by not having to provide outdoor relief either. So maybe don't give them too much credit. I know that you're big St Marylebone fans here, so if I talk badly about them, I don't mean it. Don't take it personally. If we zoom in a bit more on that page, on that volume, you can see the information gives, you can see at the top here, it gives, in the first column, it's talking about how the person leaves the workhouse. You'll see that a lot of people are dead. It will then tell you their names, their age, the time of admission, the reasons why they're admitted, and by whose order, which is usually always the overseers of the poor. And then it'll also tell you what number of the ward they're on. Then there is another facing page on that, and the information given on there gives their, the time of death or discharge, by whose order they're being discharged, and any further remarks they have on that person. So it's a fairly detailed early Marylebone workhouse record. Very, very interesting. And if you have a look, I know at the back you're not going to be able to see this too well, so I'll read it out, don't worry. The first entry at the top there is one of the earliest entries we have for Marylebone Workhouse ever. And it's for a woman called Mary Griffith. She's aged 31, and she was admitted on the 20th of October 1752. So that is very, very early for Marylebone Workhouse. The reason given is that Mary has a foul disease, that's what it says there. It's actually quite a legible record, which is very nice and very unusual for the time. This foul disease is likely referring to the fact that she's contracted a venereal disease, unfortunately for Mary. She actually, she lives with it for quite a while, and on the next page it tells us that she died in the workhouse in July 1770. So she suffered quite a bit, but there was a place for her to go during that time. Others on the page are discharged from the workhouse, others elope, so they run away. One of the inmates on this page is a child whose parents have died, and he's been apprenticed out of the workhouse, so he's gone to learn a trade. With children in the workhouse, even during the Victorian period, they tend to apprentice them out if they can, or send them to some sort of school outside to the country, outside of the city limits, or send them to some sort of training somewhere. They don't just leave them in the workhouse if they're there long term. The language used to describe the reasons for admission are, of course, outdated. So some people here are being described as lunatics, others are literally, some of it says out of their senses. Some are lame or infirm, and many are just described as poor. So it's a really varied reason, but usually the reason you're being admitted is either you're ill or you're poor. So what changes in the 19th century, in the 1800s? So people, as such as life, thought that the poor were taking advantage of the workhouse. It was viewed as a tool to kind of shirk work and kind of have an easy life, which is, looking back, it's ridiculous. You wouldn't want to go in there. So the government, in response to this attitude of the people, they set up an inquiry into the state of workhouses, and the results of this lead to the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, which is also known as the New Poor Law. This is a massive, complete change to the way poor relief is administered. So now responsibility for workhouses completely move away from the parishes, and they come under the control of the newly formed poor law unions. These unions are groupings of the parishes, basically, and each union had an elected board of guardians to govern them. These board of guardians reported to the Poor Law Commission, which is basically a newly formed government department, and they're based in Somerset House. Not all London parishes joined poor law unions in 1834. Those that had local acts or were in special unions prior to 1834 were exempted from joining a union. 11 parishes in London were exempted, and that includes St Marylebone. So they haven't yet, in 1834, come under the control of the Poor Law Commission. They have the Poor Law Commission does have some influence over Marylebone, but they're still kind of the parish vestry is still kind of in control of the workhouse, which I believe St Marylebone were very, very happy about. They didn't want anything to do with the Poor Law Commission, basically. And you'll find in lots of documents relating to St Marylebone Workhouse, when it is under the control of the parish, that they're arguing with the Poor Law Commission. They don't want to hear anything from them, and they don't want any of their influence. They're very happy to control the workhouse. These exempt parishes, so these 11 parishes in London, don't come under the control of the board of guardians until the years 1867 to 1869. So they have a good few decades running by themselves. And they only come under the Poor Law Commission when a new amendment to the Poor Law comes in, basically, in 1867. So until 1867, St Marylebone and the other churches, and the other parishes even, they're not run by the Board of Guardians, they're run by overseers of the poor, or otherwise they're called guardians of the poor. So it's very easy to confuse the two, but they are two separate things. So they, as I said, they fought against the Poor Law Commissions constantly, and things to do with religion, things to do with diet, everything you can imagine. If you go through the workhouse minute books, you'll find it in there. And this map here shows the poor law unions in the London region in 1884. So at this point, every union, every parish is in a union, and every union is controlled by the Poor Law Commission. I will say that the Poor Law Commission goes through many, many name changes throughout its time. I'm just going to stick with Poor Law Commission because I'll just confuse myself and all of you too. So I do acknowledge that it does change, but it's pretty much the same organisation. This works. Technical difficulties. There we go. So as well as requiring each poor law union to have a workhouse, so once you were formed into a union, if you didn't have a workhouse, you needed to build one. The 1834 Act also introduced a new classification system for the workhouse. And this is classifying the workhouse inmates basically based on age, sex and health. And you can see the classification system here. So they split it into 7 different classifications. So at the number 1 you've got, and this is the language of the time of course, the aged or infirm men. Number 2 was the able-bodied men and youths above 13. Number 3 is youths and boys above 7 years old and under 13. Number 4 is aged or infirm women. Number 5 is able-bodied women and girls above 16. Number 6, girls above 7 years of age and under 16. And number 7 is children under the age of 7 years. And basically, this class system dictated everything for the inmates. Their whole life is basically centred around this classification system. So it's dictating your living quarters, your diet, and the type of work you did, which is your whole life in the workhouse. Use of this system, very sadly, saw whole families torn apart due to the different classes being housed separately. So you could enter as a family, and your children could be taken away from you from both parents, and you would only be able to see them at designated times. Adult males and females, even when you're married, you were kept separated, and again, you could only see each other sparingly, and when you're told you could. Maybe some people would like that, I don't know. But there were some instances where elderly couples, elderly married couples in particular, could be housed together, but that was at the discretion of the Board of Guardians, or the overseers of the poor, in the case of St Marylebone. Not all workhouses were able to adapt to this new system in time. In order to accommodate the new classification, you'd have to keep the classes completely separate. You had to make sure that you couldn't just wander into each ward, keep the men separate from the women, that kind of thing. And of course, that takes time, that takes building, and that takes new structures within workhouses. So it took them quite a lot of time to kind of come up to scratch for the Paul Commissioners and kind of do what they wanted. There's many, many examples of workhouse masters, the guy that's running the workhouse, basically. So they're applying for extensions to construct extra buildings. And you'll find that kind of information, again, in the minute books of the workhouses. Some unions who did not have a workhouse already had to construct them from scratch. So, you know, it took a lot of time, and they'd sometimes send them to a different union until they could build their own workhouses. Due to St Marylebone being exempt from the new poor law, documents and records relating to the workhouse for the period up to 1867 remain with the parish church collection. So if you were researching Marylebone Workhouse, you need to look under St Marylebone Parish Church at the London Archives to find the documents that you're looking for. All documents relating to the workhouse post-1867 are in a different collection entirely, and that collection is called the St Marylebone Border Guardians. That's just a note if I've inspired you to come to the London Archives and do some research there. So Marylebone actually had its first workhouse in 1730, and that was kind of like a rented space, basically. And it was a direct outcome of that 1723 Workhouse Test Act. They rented the premises to act as a workhouse at this time. It's not a permanent building like that. And I will get on to the permanent building later. Speaking of the 1834 Poor Law Act, this is not St Marylebone. This is the intended plan for the West London Union Workhouse on Cornwallis Road in 1864. Workhouse buildings constructed in this period are often described as palatial. You know, they're quite beautiful buildings, a lot of them. Especially in contemporary literature, they're described as palatial. I think, looking back now, when you're writing in modern day, you're not thinking of workhouses as beautiful buildings, you're thinking of them like repression and, you know, dehumanisation, that kind of thing. But, you know, if you're looking from it neutrally, it's a very, very nice building. In reality, for many workhouses, you'll have a very high wall around them. So it's not just to keep people out, that's to keep people in as well. You need permission to leave the workhouse, and you can't just wander out or you'll be in quite a bit of trouble, maybe with magistrates even. We also have the floor plan for the workhouse that you just saw on Cornwallis Road. If you're at the front, you can see the separate spaces for each of the classes. Again, they're separated by age, sex and health. And this is the ground floor plan, so kind of on this one. You have the Asian for men and women, you've got the younger children's wards, and you've got the infirmary for sick inmates. Most workhouses have an infirmary. You'll also notice some additional wards on here too. So let me just see if I can find it. So here and over on the other side are the male and female incorrigible wards. So if you feel like misbehaving, that's kind of where you're going to end up. That's a great way of describing it. You'll also find them being called refractory wards as well. So the incorrigible wards are where they separate those who break the workhouse rules. There's very, very strict rules of the workhouse, which we'll go on to later. So one of the workhouse punishments was to end up on one of those wards for a set amount of time. So you probably end up on that kind of ward if you've managed to get drunk and you're behaving a bit disorderly, or if you've used obscene language. So I kind of have a feeling I don't end up on there quite a bit, from my language alone, obviously. There's also a bit more serious. There are imbecile wards on this plan. So just over here, completely separate from the main building of the workhouse, is the imbeciles ward for men and women. Obviously, it's completely wrong and completely inaccurate to use those terms then, but they were very much medical terms back then. And it's used to describe people with mental health conditions. Many workhouses had lunatic wards, but often more severe cases were transferred to an asylum. So St Marylebone, you'll find there's quite a few lunatic records within the St Marylebone collection. A lot of the people who are deemed lunatics are being farmed out, basically. They're being sent to the asylums like Colney Hatch and Hanwell, are two major ones that they're getting sent to. So they do still have one of these imbecile or lunatic wards at St Marylebone, but often the staff that are working there have absolutely no training. They have no idea how to handle these people. So the inmates in these wards are getting pretty much no treatment, no help. They're not getting much understanding either, so it's really a very grim place to be on that ward. I'm not sure that the county asylums will be much better, to be fair. This is the exterior of part of Marylebone Workhouse. So this is what the infirmary used to look like. And this is it being demolished, as I said, in 1898. You'll notice it's not dissimilar from the other workhouse from West London Union. Lots of workhouses tend to look the same from the outside. The workhouse here stood a stone's throw away from where we are from this church. It's just down the road. It abutted Marylebone Road and the Northumberland Street, which I don't think exists anymore. And the workhouse on that site, so on this site here, came into use in 1752, and construction on it started in 1750. So they have the temporary rented space from 1730, and in 1750 they start building their permanent space on Marylebone Road, and by 1752 it's admitting inmates. The only surviving plan that I could find for Marylebone Workhouse in the London Archives collection is this ground floor plan here, and it's by the architect Saxon Snell from around 1867 to 69. So Marylebone Workhouse went through many changes in this time, and multiple phases of building, which is why there's so much colour-coded. They're representing the different phases of building. The orange in the middle, so I don't know how orange it looks to you, but this bit here, so that is the kind of the original 18th century workhouse structures. The blue was added in the 1820s, so this bit here, so it's a bit later, and then the pink down in the bottom left is what was being constructed in 1867 to 69, and they are, Saxon Snell was the architect designing these structures, and what he's doing there is building new casual wards. So they're for the poor people who aren't coming in for a long-term stay, they're staying there for a few days. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So this new phase of construction, the pink down there, happened in 1867, when Marylebone finally came under the control of a Board of Guardians and a Royal Commission. And that was after the passing of the Metropolitan Poor Act in 1867. And it basically brought all the previously exempt parishes in line with the 1834 Poor Law. I'm not sure Marylebone was very happy about it, but that is what happened. So if we zoom in on the plan there and take a look at the earliest structures dating to the 1770s and 1780s, which is the dates given on the plan for that colour-coded part, you'll see that the workhouse is respecting the classification system through separate spaces for men and women. You would not be allowed and would be in quite a bit of trouble if you tried to enter a space that was for a different class. So if we look here, you've got the women's day rooms, the men's day rooms, the men's contagious wards, and you've got the infirmary up here. So it's a lot of quite ill people happening on the ground floor. You'll also find the administrative offices in this part of the building. So this includes the master's office, the clerk's room, and the boardroom. So the boardroom is this bit in the bottom right down here. So the boardroom is really the central hub of workhouse administration. It's where the Board of Guardians would have had their meetings, or the overseers of the poor, or the guardians of the poor, whatever you want to call them. And that's where all the decisions about what you're going to eat, what kind of work the inmates are going to do, it's all happening in there. And that's where all the arguments with the Poor Commission happens as well. So basically, you'll see in the middle there's just a blank space. And so the workhouse was originally built around basically a courtyard design. And it basically, it just was basically to lead up to this chapel up here. It's St Marylebone Workhouse. They're quite into their Christianity, shockingly. So if we go on to the next slide, come on. This is an engraving of that central courtyard that was just in the previous slide there. It's actually based on a drawing by one of the inmates. And through this courtyard, again, you'd reach the chapel. The chapel is really a central feature of Marylebone Workhouse. Having the parish vestry so heavily involved in running a workhouse meant that religion was an especially important aspect of workhouse life. I think in most workhouses it was kind of pushed, but in Marylebone particularly they are very, very big on it. Basically the workhouse was full of verse and scripture and Christian ideology. It would have been very much pressed on the inmates, although technically they couldn't force the inmates to go to the chapel. And those of other faiths, such as Catholics, should have been allowed to see a Catholic priest upon request. And the Poor Law Commission really tried to influence Marylebone to make sure that this freedom of religion was happening, basically. And it did seem to. They would bring in like a Catholic priest if someone requested it, but they would have to request it. So yes. You'll also find that the Poor Law Commission tried to pass new legislation, basically, to really expand on this religious freedom. And there's some pushback from quite a few workhouses on this, saying that they think that the system currently as it was working, they didn't need to do any more. And that was like a common attitude back then, it wasn't just Marylebone. Unfortunately, the plan you just saw of Marylebone Workhouse is one of the very few to survive anywhere, not just at the London Archives. So we only have the ground floor plan of Marylebone Workhouse at the London Archives. It would have been much bigger than that. But by around 1900, Marylebone Workhouse consisted of 2 5-storey buildings and many other blocks of varying sizes too. So you're only seeing on that plan a very small part of what the workhouse would look like, which is quite a shame, because we'll never really know what it's going to what all the wards were and where they were situated and all that kind of thing. But this here, I borrowed it from a different Board of Guardians. This is the plans for the Brentford Union Workhouse. You're looking at the so-called able-bodied women's and men's dormitories. So you've got the women's on the left, the men's on the right. And the main difference you'll see in these plans that whilst men have their own single beds, women have had to share a double bed. And you're very unlikely to know the person you're sharing with, so it sounds like a nightmare to me. So privacy is not really a thing at the workhouse. It doesn't exist. You're very much in a communal space 100% of the time. And you'll also notice, I think these are supposed to represent toilets. So for that many people, you've only got 2 in that space. So, fairly grim. But I suppose you're lucky to have an inside one at that time at all. So in 1840, Marylebone's capacity was around 1,400 inmates, and that's excluding the infirmary. So that's just for regular inmates of the workhouse. But this capacity was far exceeded during the years of the Irish famine in the mid to late 1840s. Many, many Irish, I'm talking about Irish again, I seem to talk about Irish a lot, come to Marylebone, and this is kind of rely on the workhouse to kind of keep them during that time. They've come from desperate situations over in Ireland, and they're very, very desperate to stay here and be looked after for a certain amount of time. So during that period, the population actually peaked at just under 2,200 inmates. So they've really packed it in. So they've taken over every space in the workhouse, they've just shoved a bed in it, and they've put them there. It could be anywhere, like the kitchens, the storeroom, the clerk's office, that kind of thing. They've taken over the whole space, just so they can house the demand that was put on them. In 1900, they kind of see the need, the demand has risen and they need more space within the workhouse. So they do a bit more building, more construction, and they increase their capacity to 1,900. So in the space of 60 years, it goes from 1,400 to 1,900, which isn't a bad expansion. Not every inmate came to the workhouse to stay long term. Some came to stay for 1 or 2 nights, and they were known as the casual poor. They would do some menial work in exchange for food and shelter, basically, in one of the workhouse's casual wards. So you're now looking at the interior of the pink buildings that were in that plan, so in the bottom left of that plan. This is what they would look like. So you've got another plan by Sachs and Snell here of what their intended view of the casual ward would look like, and then you've got the interior view on the left. And that comes from an illustration in Illustrated London News. So this was built in 1867. The walls would actually be painted blue, and the text would be all in red. basically. All of this here, I don't know if you can see at the back, but it's all religious text. It says on the top here, God is truth, God is good, God is holy, God is just. Lots of stuff about God, basically. And you've got the Our Father on the back wall, and lots of verse on the sides as well. So it's really, you're really surrounded by Christian text everywhere in the capital wards. It's quite intense, but it did give the house poor somewhere to sleep for the night, without having to be admitted to the workhouse long term, basically. So you could be put to work doing things like stone breaking or oakum picking or bone crushing, or cleaning or some other task before you leave. And usually the people that are coming into the casual ward are staying 1 or 2 nights, and then they're leaving. You do get people called the ins and outs, and basically they come there for the day, they leave, and maybe a day or 2 later they're back in. And that's kind of how they're living. It didn't make the Board of Guardians very happy, but it was kind of allowed. But how did you get into the workhouse in the first place is a good question. So to be granted entry into the workhouse, you would first need to be interviewed in order for your circumstances to be established and assessed. So the board of guardians would have final say on who could be admitted, and if there was any doubt about your true circumstances, if you thought you were lying about how much money you had or whether you had a house, you could be summoned before the board to plead your case. That happened many, many times, and it was extremely intimidating for people. I mean, you're in a terrible situation anyway, you have no choice but to enter the workhouse, and now someone's questioning you over whether you have, a few pennies on you. If you enter the workhouse and they found money on you, you could get basically arrested for that, especially if you tried to hide it. So yeah, it's quite a serious thing to try and get into a workhouse, and it's not easy either. Newly arrived inmates would be put on a probationary ward or a receiving ward, and you would be examined by a medical officer to make sure you're not bringing any disease into the workhouse. You can imagine how quickly it would spread in such a confined space. You would then be bathed, your clothes would be taken away from you, you'd be issued the workhouse uniform. And it's not quite clear, I don't think it's really regulated what the workhouse uniform was, so it would vary from workhouse to workhouse. And you would only get your clothes back if and when you left the workhouse. And that's kind of, I suppose, in a way to prevent people from eloping, from running away. It would be very, very obvious to people outside the workhouse that that's where you came from. You'd be caught very, very quickly if you did run away. You would also need to go through a settlement examination to determine if you were the responsibility of the poor law union you were applying for poor relief from. I think some of you came to a talk I gave at the London Archives about Irish pauper removals, so this might sound a bit familiar to you. So if you were found to be from outside the union you're applying for relief from, you could be forcibly removed from that union and returned to where they believed you came from. This was pretty much purely for financial reasons. They didn't want to pay to look after these people if they didn't have to, but it led to some, again, very sad situations. So this here is the removal order for Mary Smith, aged 20, and she'd been living at the workhouse at St Luke's in Chelsea, which was another workhouse that was exempt from the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. And on the 11th of May 1847, Mary was ordered to be removed from the parish as she was deemed to have no settlement in England. So they basically thought that because she was applying for relief, she didn't have a right to stay because she'd barely been in England. But of course at this time, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. She was found to have been born in County Cork, Ireland, having left there only 9 months prior to applying for relief. The note on the left, so the handwritten bit just here, which I don't expect any of you to be able to read, basically it confirms that Mary Smith was returned to Ireland shortly after this removal order was signed. And unfortunately for Mary, the year was 1847, it was the peak of the Great Hunger in Ireland. And Cork, which she would be returned to, as she was from there, was extremely badly affected. So basically, her applying for relief at St Luke's and trying to get into a workhouse could have been a death sentence for Mary. It's very unlikely, given how poor she was, she had to apply for the workhouse, that she would have had any prospects back in Cork. She left for a reason and they sent her back. So moving on to the daily life after that bit depressing thing. So we'll talk about daily life. So life in the workhouse was extremely, as I said, strictly regimented. With set times to wake up, to eat, to work and sleep. A bit like being in prison, some might say. All able-bodied men and women were required to work to stay in the workhouse, as the name suggests. Common jobs, as I've said, included stone breaking, bone crushing, and oakum picking for men. Women, such as life, were usually set to domestic tasks, keeping the workhouse clean and helping in the laundry. Laundry, as you can imagine, was a major part of workhouse life. The number of inmates meant a massive number of garments needed to be washed each week. So St Pancras, as you can see here, this is an illustration of St Pancras Workhouse and their laundry room. It was a similar sized workhouse to Marylebone, and St Pancras estimated that they washed about 8,000 garments a week. So, you know, the amount of women that would be required to do it by hand would be incredible. So basically what St Pancras did to make it a bit easier is they invested in new steam-powered washing machinery, very good for its time, to assist with the great quantities. I'm not sure if and when Marylebone ever got it, so God knows how long the women were doing it by hand. I don't envy them. Diet, especially when the new Act was introduced in 1834, was kept deliberately bland and unappealing to try and deter people from entering the workhouse. So you've entered hungry and desperate, and they think you're lying, basically, and that you're just too lazy to work, so they feed you badly. It's quite sad. The main constituent of the diet was bread. Basically, the understanding of nutritional needs didn't see much improvement until the late 1840s, when widespread crop failures kind of prompted research into dietary needs and requirements. In 1845, there was a big workhouse scandal at Andover, and it saw inmates gnawing on the bones that they were tasked with crushing, trying to get the gristle off of it, because they had not been given a good enough food, basically. The workhouse master had been using the funds that he should have spent on the food for his own personal use. Think Mr. Bumble. Other workhouse masters are quite the opposite, and you can actually see that they're trying quite hard to do well for their inmates. They're trying to procure the finest ingredients, the best meat, the best bread, everything, but all doing that within quite a small budget. You can often find in minute books, again, and letter books at the archives, that the masters are often writing to the board of guardians that runs the union to inform them of the poor quality of the meats and the breads, and also give details on how they've tried to improve it. So it's not every workhouse master is bad. It just happens that a lot of them were. The workhouse experience really did vary quite greatly depending on which workhouse you were in and at what time. So they're not all good and not all bad all the time. This photograph right here is actually St Marylebone. So this is the interior of Marylebone's workhouse's dining hall in 1901. So we've just snuck in because that is right at the end of the Victorian period. You'll notice that the different classes ate separately. So this is all men. And you'll also notice that the layout is designed to not encourage talking or friendliness between inmates. They were seated to not be facing each other, so it wasn't conducive to conversation. As this is very late Victorian, the diet would have improved from what it was early at the time. They weren't quite so strict with, just a lot of bread and that kind of thing. So you would have eaten a bit better. And you'll also notice that they're kind of all wearing very similar things. So that's kind of one type of workhouse uniform. It's not all exactly the same, but it's kind of, a bit ragged. So these are some of the dietary tables for Marylebone Workhouse in the year 1846, so they're quite early dietary tables. You can see they are split into different classes, so things like able-bodied men and women, boys and girls in school, infants, aged and infirm in convalescent wards, mothers nursing children, and then there's two more classes as well. One of them is literally called the vicious class, and that's for people in the incorrigible wards. So they're on what's called a low diet, so it's a reduced diet, reduced from something that's not even particularly good, so it's not ideal if you're on that. If you look at the able-bodied men and women, they got about 5 pounds and 4 ounces of bread per week. So bread is the main constituent of their diet. Other foodstuffs included beef, potatoes, cheese, rice pudding, porridge, suet and beer, and that's kind of it. So you're having that all week, every week, for the entirety of your stay. And you know, there's no vegetables mentioned, and there is devoid of fruit. So you're not going to come, you probably pick out with scurvy in all fairness. But so it's not the healthiest, but it's 1846 and they don't really have this understanding of nutritional needs. They're more quantity over quality. Yeah, quantity over quality, when it really might need to be the other way around. And it does, as time goes on, they do start introducing vegetables as part of every meal. And yes, gruel was part of a workhouse staple. So it's not in those dietary tables, but it would have been served. So gruel is a thin type of porridge, basically. And I'm sure you'll all be running to try it afterwards. Emma's gone to all that work to make it. As Emma said, recipes do vary. It's not just one set recipe, you'll find all sorts all over. This recipe here is from the collections of the London Archives. It's handwritten by a reverend in 1845. And it's titled Gruel for Poor People. Very descriptive. So basically the recipe is, if you want to make it later, 2 teacupfuls full of groats to 3 quarts of water and an ounce of brown sugar, a little allspice, and when boiled, add half a pint of beer by half a peck of groats at a time. Delicious. So I think this is probably actually one of the nicer gruel recipes out there. It's got a good quantity of sugar, good quantity of allspice, good quantity of beer, and I don't think any of those things would have gone into a workhouse gruel. You wanted to save a bit of money, and again, sugar was expensive back then. So that's actually the posh poor people version of gruel. It would have been a lot less flavourful at the workhouse, I imagine. Life in the workhouse being so strictly regimented meant that there was zero tolerance for bad behaviour. This here is Marylebone Workhouse's punishment book, which is quite a rare survival. You won't find many of these in other workhouse collections, so it's quite interesting. It gives the names, offences and punishments for inmates who break the rules. You'll see them up there. That's what it says at the top, basically. So less serious offence would kind of be dealt with in-house. They'd punish them within the workhouse. But if you did something that was deemed more serious, you could be taken before a magistrate. So if we look at the first entry up here, for Ellen Maloney, she committed, and this is what it says under the offence, refractory behaviour, and made use of obscene language. Terrible. Her punishment was to be taken before a magistrate. She was actually sentenced to 14 days imprisonment for that. Obviously, we don't know what her refractory conduct was, but it doesn't say she hit anyone or anything, which it usually would. If they assault someone, it would usually say it. So it does seem quite harsh to put her in prison for, swearing. But it's Victorian times, they do a lot worse. The fourth case is Jane Chapman, so just here. And she's a woman after my own heart because she refused to leave her bed for 2 days. And for this, that was an in-house punishment, and she was limited to 8 ounces of bread only for dinner for 1 day. So she kind of got away quite lightly. She didn't have to do any work those 2 days. And all they did was just feed her a bit of bread, which was mostly on anyway, so fair play to her. And then you get to a more serious case, down here, number 6 is George Ackett. And George was disorderly and hit another inmate and assaulted an officer, so he went wild. And for this, kind of understandably, he was sent before a magistrate and he was sentenced to, I think, was it 5 days imprisonment, and that was with hard labour. So quite tough. And then he'd be let out and he'd probably have to come back to the workhouse after that and face the people he just assaulted. So not great for George. But to administer a punishment such as a restricted diet, so for Jane over there, who had her diet restricted to 8 ounces of bread, that had to be signed off by a medical officer or by the workhouse master, and that's kind of to try and prevent an abuse of power. You can't just, limit someone's diet for no reason. It needs to be signed off, and there has to be a good reason for it to be happening. As we have seen with what happened at Andover in 1845 and him squaring away the funds for the food, workhouse masters can't always be trusted. So, nor can my laptop, there we go. So there are tales of workhouse masters abusing their power at many workhouses, and this includes, unfortunately, Marylebone Workhouse. So you can kind of see where Jenkins got his inspiration for Mr. Bumble with all these incidents going on. So Marylebone's master, Richard Ryan, at the time, caused massive scandal in 1856 after it was reported that officers in the workhouse, including the master Ryan himself, had badly beaten several young girls. Initially, the guardians of the poor for Marylebone didn't really want to do anything past telling off the people who had done that. They were quite happy to sweep under the carpet. They didn't want this big scandal happening. Unfortunately for them, it got out, and then the Poor Law Commissioners got involved, and then eventually Ryan was sacked for it. The incident, much to the chagrin of St Marylebone, I imagine, was memorialised through this broadside ballad called The Women Floggers Lament at Marylebone Workhouse. Broadside ballads were sold cheaply and printed cheaply. They're sold on the streets of London, basically, and the songs are meant to be learned and performed, kind of in taverns or at home, that kind of thing. It's not high-class entertainment, but for the common people, this was like maths, basically, or Love Island of the time. So I'll just read, I'm not going to sing it for you, I know you'll all be very upset to hear that. I'll just read you the chorus of it. Oh, where shall we wander, or where shall we roam, sirs? As we walk through the streets, folks won't leave us alone, sirs. Kicked out of the workhouse in Marylebone, sirs, for flogging the sweet little girls. So they went around singing that, which is a bit strange, but it does show that people they didn't ignore the things that happened in the workhouse completely. They were aware of these things happening. They did kind of, take the mickey out of it a bit, but they didn't agree with what was going on in the workhouse either. They wanted Richard Ryan and the other people who were involved in hitting these girls to be fired. And eventually, with the government intervention through the Poor Law Commission, they were gotten rid of. So you really can't always trust the workhouse masters. They've usually got something in there to gain, but they're not always the most trustworthy people in the world, unfortunately. So I'm going to finish by talking about the stigma that surrounded the inmates entering the workhouse. Having to enter the workhouse was deeply shameful to the people, and it was deeply dreaded by those who had to do it. You would do anything you could to avoid having to become an inmate. Many people saw it as a failure, thought that those who entered were shirking work and a burden on the country. Children born in the workhouse would be tarnished by it, so much so that they eventually had to start anonymising the address on the baptisms, so people wouldn't know that they were born in a workhouse. And once you got into the workhouse, it became then very, very difficult for you to leave. You're stuck in there unless you get permission to leave and go out. So then how do you get a job to support yourself outside of the workhouse? You're kind of stuck in there once you're in there. Henry Mayhew, who was a famous Victorian social investigator, known for interviewing London's poor, wrote that when interviewing a blind tailor, he said that he dreads the workhouse for the workhouse coat is a slothful, degrading badge. The poor do not want to go in it. So I think when the Poor Law Commission came about, due to the fact that people thought everyone going to the workhouse was lazy and just didn't want to work, it's complete nonsense. They do want to work, there's just not enough work for them to do. So you'll also, to get to the basics, you're called an inmate, so you're basically compared to a prisoner. So it's like poverty's a crime, basically. And you have your daily life dictated to you. So you're an adult going to the workhouse and you're being told when to sleep, when to eat, when to get up and what work you have to do. And then you're also, you're being judged for the crime of being poor, and it was a very, very difficult way to live. So thank you for coming, and if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to try and answer them.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there will be lots of questions. One first, yeah?
What happened to the people who died? Who were responsible for their burial?
So sometimes you'll find on these registers, these discharge registers when people have died, there might be someone that comes in and claims the body and will pay to bury it themselves. Otherwise, it's down to the workhouse themselves and to the kind of poor rates of that union, and they'll be put in a pauper's grave. It won't be marked.
Thank you. It was really interesting. What would be the average stay? Because if some people were there for 2 nights, but you couldn't live there indefinitely like boarding school, could you? You'd have to go at some point.
Yeah, so I think occasionally people do spend their whole lives in the workhouse. I think it's quite rare that that will happen, because if you go in quite young, they'll apprentice you out, they'll send you to school, they'll try to do something with you to improve your life. They think that when children go in, it's not their fault, it's the parents' fault, basically. So they do try and help you out. If you're an adult, I'm honestly not 100% sure. The average stay, I think it varies greatly, but it's probably like a few months is the average stay. I mean, you don't want to stay in there if you don't have to. And you would only stay a few days if you're in the casual wards, not if you're in the regular wards on the workhouse.
Thank you.
We have another question.
Can I ask what made you study this?
Yes. So
It's a very unusual subject.
so I did this especially for Marylebone, this lecture series.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I gave a talk last September on Victorian workhouses in London generally. And my work on as a curator on that Victorian exhibition, I did lots of work on workhouses and especially on workhouse diets. I wrote quite a bit about that. So transferring it to focus solely on Marylebone wasn't too tricky.
But do you have any family history or anything like that?
Absolutely not.
Not that they were in the workhouse. But
So no, my family aren't really from England, so no, I don't, and I've studied, my master's is in the Archaeology and Heritage of Egypt and the Middle East, so it's a complete departure from my norm.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
When was the Marylebone Workhouse closed down, and was it demolished?
Yes, so the workhouse buildings have been demolished. There is one surviving ancillary building, which was the dispensary, so the facade of the dispensary is still there, you can still see it, but the actual main workhouse buildings, they're completely gone. And I think it closed I think most workhouses closed in like 1930. By that point it was known as St Marylebone Institution. The workhouses, that term had gone out of use.
Question.
Can I just mention there's a book on the history of the Marylebone Workhouse from the Spanish Society, and it was still operating until 1965, so it was an old people's home, and it had 1,000 residents in the one building, and it sat on the site of the University of Westminster and Luxborough Tower, because that was the site. And the paupers' graves, you're talking about some of the burials, they're in Paddington Memorial Gardens. So some of the paupers' graves are still under the memorial, the gardens in
Yeah, just to add on from that, the London Archives has a website called the London Picture Archive. It's got about 250,000 of our visual collections on that, so photographs, maps, plans, everything you can think of, illustrations. If you type in Marylebone Institution, you'll find photographs of that time, and also if you type in Luxborough Lodge as well, you'll find lots of photographs as well. It's worth a look.
Rachel, we have a question here.
Hello, yes, I can say what happened to at least one family. Funny enough, it was Jeremy Paxman's edition of Who Do You Think You Are? And his family actually came from Norfolk, and after several visits of his ancestors in and out of the workhouse, the poor law guardians got fed up, and they basically sent them off to the northwest to work in the mills.
That's about right. Yeah. Farm them out.
Yeah. Apparently that wasn't unusual. You know, you'll find some families. You know, they want some work. Okay, there's work in the mills.
Yeah. You'll find that like London workhouses, London poorer unions and parishes have so much power compared to other parts of the country, and they're much, much richer. So they just get away with sending paupers basically anywhere without question. So if you want to send them to the north, you can send them to the north. But yeah, I didn't know that about Jeremy Paxman.
No, nor did he. It was quite hilarious.
So when people, after a few months, when people got discharged, why would it be that they got discharged? And why would some people stay for their whole life?
I think the people that got discharged probably had help from the outside, so they would have family or friends who could support them for a bit or could get them a job. Again, staying in the workhouse your whole life is extremely unusual. And there would probably be a reason like that you might have some sort of medical condition, that kind of thing. Not bad enough to be sent to an institution or an asylum or anything like that, but you might just end up stuck there and people just fell through the gaps and nobody really paid any attention. But that would be very unusual.
Question here?
I think there's a memorial to to a woman that helped in this area, didn't she, for destitute people? Isn't there a memorial in our church for anyone, a woman that rescued people? No, recollect. No.
With the very poor feeding and lack of fruit and vegetables, there must have been an awful amount of illness. Did a lot of people die of TB? Was TB rife in these places?
Honestly, I don't know the stats and I don't know, but I would say, TB consumption would have been, it was a big thing back then anyway, so I think in a damp workhouse, you'll find the Lancet actually did a report on Marylebone and its infirmary, like back then in around 1867 or something, or 1865 or something like that, don't quote me on the dates. But they went in and did like an assessment of their infirmary and found that it wasn't up to scratch, that it was kind of falling down and it was a bit damp. So in those conditions, I imagine consumption would have been rife. And when the Irish came during the famine, obviously there was something called Irish fever, because of the conditions in Ireland and a condition like the overcrowding that came with the Irish trying to find somewhere to live. There was a lot of typhus around, so that would probably go around the workhouse as well.
How were workhouses financed?
Yeah.
Was it taxation or charity?
So, yeah, it's taxation. So it's definitely not charity. So there's something called the poor rates, and each parish, so people in the parish that kind of own land or something like that. Don't quote me again. Do your own research on the poor rates, but basically, if you earned enough, you would have to pay the contributions towards the poor rates. They would go to them looking after poor relief. So they would initially be like the kind of parish-based, but then the poor union would kind of use that money for the workhouse. And that poor rates have been around for centuries as well. Yeah.
Any more questions? Anyone? No? Right, okay, thank you so much, Rachel. And then now is your opportunity to just reach out to her before she leaves.
Yes, feel free.